investors billions in losses. Enron has become the leading symbol of corporate scandal.
The second-digit numbers of the Enron's balance sheets, published by the Wall Street Journal, violated Benford's law. The publication of this finding in an article instigated the opening of an investigation that resulted in the fall, due to fraud, of two large companies, Enron and its auditing company, Arthur Andersen. Over time, Benford's law became the numerical test par excellence for fraud detection. Nowadays, anyone scheming a fraud takes Benford's law into account. But of course, in 2004, at the time of the Venezuelan referendum, Benford's law was unknown and unthinkable because it is counterintuitive. Therefore, it was impossible that anyone could have foreseen it. A few weeks after the referendum, the Carter Center receives two allegations of fraud in reports showing that the number of no votes reported by the voting machines was anomalous because they didn't reflect Benford's law. The theoretical physicist Imre Mikus and the mathematicians Luis Raúl Perici and David Torres sent two separate studies to the Carter Center in which the results of the Venezuelan referendum of 2004 do show overwhelming anomalies. Both studies, similar to each other, were based on Benford's law. They no longer relied on the analysis of the first digit, but instead on the second, since the cap of voters per machine affected the behavior of the first digit. In the Perici-Torres study, for example, it was estimated that the probability that the no votes emitted by the voting machines in accordance with Benford's law, which is fulfilled by the votes of all elections, was practically non-existent, as unlikely as flipping 120 coins and all 120 coins showing heads. Something even more revealing appeared on the further second digits analysis. The pattern was just the same as those generated by computers. Houston, we've got another problem. So what does the Carter Center do with these studies based on Benford's law? They forward them to two experts from their staff, Dr. Henry Brady, who only observes the first digits of the current election and rejects these allegations of fraud, even though the work of Perici and Torres explains that to corroborate fraud, you should observe the behavior of the second digit and not the first. And they also forwarded the studies to Dr. Jonathan Taylor, who, observing how the second digits of the votes of two virtual elections that he generates in his computer violate Benford's law, concludes that the actual number of votes doesn't necessarily have to comply with Benford's law. And for that reason, it also disqualifies the allegations.
Forensics, it's a hopefully growing new field that combines political science with statistics, a little bit of law, a lot of computer science, and is really, really important.
But Dr. Walter Mebane, the most definite authority on electoral fraud, observed that none of the two mathematical models used by Taylor to generate results on his computer had the complexity necessary to produce the results that fulfilled Benford's law. It was unthinkable that for such an endeavor, an academic of Taylor's stature would use simulated numbers instead of real numbers. The Carter Center concluded, "It is the opinion of the Carter Center that the August 15th vote expressed the will of the Venezuelan electorate. The Center did not observe the credible evidence of fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election, and thus the cries of fraud were silenced for a time." Perhaps the key to understanding all the Venezuelan electoral processes is contained in a simple list. Simple, yes, but devastating. A list that has brought about exiles, suicides, financial ruin, firings, and death. It was known as the Tascon list and had come about from the petition for a recall referendum on President Chavez in 2003. The list owes its name to a deceased pro-government legislator named Luis Tascon, who got hold from the Electoral Council of first names, last names, and identity cards numbers of all the citizens who signed the petition for the presidential recall referendum. But Tascon not only created the notorious list, he also posted it on a website so that the country's leadership could find online who had signed and who had not. Those citizens who signed the petition in 2003 were penalized for their intention to eject Hugo Chavez from the presidency. The government was responsible for their dismissal, expropriation, imprisonment, and exile. The apparent intention of those who signed the petition was to activate the presidential recall referendum and vote yes to remove Chavez from the presidency. In the more affluent areas of the country, the percentage of people who signed the recall petition was very high. Not so in less affluent municipalities or rural areas. It was not to be expected that in such widely different socio-economical areas, there would be a direct correlation between the number of yes votes and the signatures on the petition. However, there was 1.16 yes votes per signature, even in those rural areas without collection centers for signatures. In the voting centers in the more economically affluent neighborhoods, the signatures turned into yes votes. The rest of the votes, from people who had not expressed their political opinion and had not signed the petition for whatever reason, were reasonably distributed between yes and no votes. But in digital polling stations in rural areas or in economically deprived urban areas, this was not the case. The signatures on the petition turned into yes votes, but nearly all the rest of the voters cast no votes. This was a direct result of the fact that in these areas, the ratio of signatures to votes tended to have the same value as in the previous instances, 1.16 yes votes per signature. Gustavo Delfino and Guillermo Salas, upon noticing this trend, posed the following hypothesis. In computerized centers, official results were forced to follow a linear relationship with respect to the numbers of signatures. This would be a way to subtract more than 1 million yes votes and add them to the no votes. The response Delfino and Salas received from the editors of Statistical Science, the journal to which they submitted their article, states,
"Your paper has been carefully reviewed by an editor and some expert referees. As you know, our plan is to publish this paper as part of a special section of analysis of the Venezuelan referendums. Please download the 3 reports on your paper, which you should use to guide your revision. The 3rd report by Rodrigo Medina, a very impressive verification of your hypothesis."
Verification of the hypothesis of Delfino and Salas by Rodrigo Medina, doctor in physics. It is verified, in agreement with the hypothesis presented by Delfino and Salas, that the official results of the recall referendum of 2004 in each automated center were invented based on the number of signatures. The magnitude of the difference between the official results and the real results was estimated at 1,370,000 votes with an error of 20%. According to this hypothesis, the suspension of the audits of the results that occurred during the recall was selective and not by chance, as the Carter Center maintained. To be able to carry out a selective suspension of the audit, a control system that can interact with the machines is required. But did it exist? Many Venezuelans, such as Professor Luis Marin, a law professor at the Central University of Venezuela, felt a huge mistrust of the outsized use of technology. In his article, El Tonto de la Colina, an evident allusion to an opposition group that defends and supports the use of all this electoral technology, he states, "They want us to believe that all of this equipment, the Smartmatic, the fingerprint capture technology, the data transmission system, is there to defend your vote and my vote." For those who defend the Delfino and Salas hypothesis, the presence of the fingerprint capture technology in the voting centers existed for a very different reason than the regime's version. The fingerprint capture was just an excuse to place laptops permanently connected to satellite dishes a few meters away from the voting machines. This was an authentic Trojan horse to introduce a control system in the audited polling centers and monitor the voting in real time. As such, the government can include the data of millions of people, real or not, whose existence and identity are impossible to verify in the voting records. Needless to say, as of that moment, the source file that fed into the electoral registry began to expand in a shameless and extreme rate.
An 11-year-old boy just hacked into an imitation state voting website in less than 10 minutes, and he wasn't the only one. DEF CON is one of the world's largest hacker conferences where hackers and cybersecurity experts attempt to break into computer security systems. One of the conference's main purposes is to show how easy it is to manipulate software and hardware, and this year about 50 children ages 8 to 16 attended. One of the features at the event was the DEF CON voting machine hacking village, which included 13 websites that imitated voting sites from presidential battleground states. That's according to PBS. The 11-year-old boy was able to hack into an imitation of Florida's site in less than 10 minutes.
Referendum in Venezuela, a number of scientific articles corroborated the massive electronic fraud that had taken place. Of course, articles that contradict and even discredit their authors have not been lacking. But the reality is that throughout the world, many refer to the Venezuelan elections as fraudulent. And it does not happen only in Venezuela, it happens in other parts of the world as well. In the 2012 presidential election, Barack Obama, like many other US citizens, cast his vote on a machine utilizing Smartmatic technology. A German court, in a single sentence, solves the dilemma of the voting machines. A citizen has the right to understand how he exercises his right to vote. An election cannot be an act of faith.